Picture this. An Athenian councillor named Leonidas stands up in a crowded assembly on the island of Salamis. He raises his hand and makes a logical suggestion. Maybe we should listen to the Persian peace offer. The crowd doesn't boo, they don't argue. Instead, the other councillors surround him and stone him to death right on the floor of the debate hall. But it doesn't end there. The women of Athens, hearing the commotion, rush to Leonidas' house, drag his wife and children into the street, and stone them to death too. This isn't a scene from a horror movie. This was the reality of 479 BC. The Greeks were done with diplomacy. They were traumatized, homeless, and bloodthirsty. The 300 Spartans at Thermopylae were dead, Athens was a smoking ruin, and the only language left was violence. This brutal, zero-tolerance mindset sets the stage for the final showdown. This is the Battle of Plataea, the story of how the Greeks stopped being victims and became butchers. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. That murder of Leonidas proves one thing: the Greeks were desperate. King Xerxes had left, but the threat hadn't. He left behind General Mardonius, a man far more dangerous than the king. Mardonius wasn't a tourist, he was a shark. He sat in the plains of Boeotia with 300,000 of the empire's deadliest killers, effectively holding a knife to the throat of Greece. He burned Athens a second time just to prove a point: I am still here. The Athenians, living as refugees, had reached their breaking point. They sent runners to Sparta with a message that wasn't a plea for help, it was a threat. They told the Spartan ephors, if you don't march now, the Athenian navy joins Persia, and when that happens, your walls won't save you. It was the wake-up call of the century. The Spartans had been dragging their feet, hiding behind the Isthmus of Corinth, hoping the problem would go away. But faced with the prospect of a Persian-Athenian alliance, the Spartan war machine finally kicked into gear. And when Sparta moves, the ground shakes. In a single night, the ephors issued a mobilization order that defies belief. They didn't just send a vanguard, they emptied the city. 5,000 Spartiates, the elite of the elite, suited up. But here is the rare logistical detail that shows the scale of their intent. They brought the slaves. For every single Spartan knight, 7 Helot slaves were armed and ordered to march. That is 35,000 conscripted servants marching to war alongside their masters. Combined with 5,000 other provincial troops, a massive column of 45,000 men vanished from the Peloponnese before sunrise. When the Athenian envoys woke up the next morning to scream at the Spartan leaders, the ephors simply checked the sun and said, "You can stop shouting, the army is already at the border, the hunt has begun." While the Spartans were marching north, kicking up dust and terror in equal measure, General Mardonius was already making his move. And this is where we need to stop and correct a massive misconception about the Persian Wars. In pop culture, the Persians are often depicted as a mindless horde, a swarm of unskilled slaves driven by whips. That is propaganda, pure and simple. The army Mardonius kept in Greece was nothing like the bloated parade force Xerxes had brought with him. Mardonius had trimmed the fat. He sent the conscripts home. What remained was a lean, mean, professional killing machine of 300,000 men. These were the immortals, the heavy infantry who had broken the Spartan line at Thermopylae. These were the Saka horse archers from the Central Asian steppes, men who could put an arrow through a greave slit while riding at full gallop. Mardonius wasn't relying on numbers. He was relying on speed, mobility, and superior tactical flexibility. When his scouts reported that the Spartans had finally left the Peloponnese, Mardonius didn't panic. He smiled. This was exactly what he wanted. He knew he couldn't fight the heavy Greek hoplites in the narrow streets of Athens. That would be suicide. He needed room to maneuver. So, he gave the order to evacuate Athens, but not before delivering a final insult. He ordered the city to be razed to the ground. Anything that was still standing after the first invasion, walls, houses, temples, was pulled down, smashed or burned. He turned Athens into a graveyard of broken stone, leaving the Greeks nothing to return to but ash. It was a scorched earth policy designed to break their hearts before the battle even started. Then, Mardonius withdrew his forces north into Boeotia, near the city of Thebes. This wasn't a retreat, it was a trap. He chose his ground with the precision of a chess grandmaster. He set up camp along the Asopus River, in the flat, open plains of Plataea. Why there? Because Greek hoplite tactics had a fatal flaw. They were slow. The Phalanx was an unstoppable wall of bronze, yes, but it turned like a battleship. On flat ground, Mardonius's cavalry could dance around them, flank them, and pepper them with arrows until they broke. He built a massive fortified stockade, a square mile of wooden walls and towers, creating a secure base of operations. He effectively built a city of war in the middle of a field and sat back, waiting for the Greeks to walk into the slaughterhouse. And they almost did. The allied Greek army, now swelling with reinforcements from every city-state that wasn't collaborating with Persia, arrived at the southern edge of the plain. They looked down from the foothills of Mount Cithaeron and saw the ocean of Persian tents. They saw the glittering armour of the immortals and the thousands of horses grazing by the river. And the Greek commanders, led by the Spartan Regent Pausanias, did the only smart thing they could do. They stopped. They refused to go down onto the plain. They hugged the rocky slopes of the mountain, where the Persian cavalry couldn't reach them. It became a high-stakes staring contest. Mardonius down in the valley, Pausanias up on the ridge. Days passed. Mardonius grew impatient. He hadn't stayed in Greece to look at Spartans, he stayed to kill them. He decided to test their resolve. He didn't send his infantry. He sent his cavalry commander, a man named Mecistius. Now, Mecistius is a character who deserves his own movie. He was the most popular man in the Persian army, a giant of a figure, riding a Nisaean stallion with a bridle made of solid gold. He led a squadron of cavalry right up the slopes to harass the Greek lines. They rode in circles, hooting, jeering and raining arrows down on the exposed Greek infantry. They called the Spartans women for hiding in the hills. It was humiliating. The Greeks were taking casualties, unable to strike back against these hit-and-run tactics. The Megarians, a contingent of Greek allies, were pinned down and on the verge of routing. They sent a desperate message to Pausanias: "Send help or we leave." Pausanias looked around at his commanders. Who would volunteer to go down and fight cavalry on open ground? It was a suicide mission. But a group of 300 Athenians stepped forward, an echo of the 300 Spartans. They rushed down to support the Megarians, bringing archers of their own. In the chaotic skirmish that followed, luck intervened. An arrow struck Mecistius's horse in the flank. The beast reared up in pain, throwing the Persian commander to the ground. The moment he hit the dirt, the Athenians swarmed him. But here is a detail that shows just how advanced Persian engineering was. They couldn't kill him. Mecistius was wearing a suit of scale armour under his purple tunic that was impenetrable. The Greeks were hacking at him, and their swords were bouncing off. He was fighting back, a gold-clad tank of a man, until one soldier realised the trick. He jammed the spike of his spear through the eye-hole of Mecistius's helmet. The giant fell. The death of Mecistius sent a shockwave through the Persian army. The cavalry charged recklessly to recover his body, leading to a brutal, dusty brawl over the corpse. But the Greeks held their ground. They hoisted the body of the Persian commander onto a cart and paraded it through the ranks. It was a massive morale boost. They had drawn first blood. They had killed the enemy's favourite son, but Pausanias knew this was just the prologue. Mardonius was watching from the valley floor, and he was no longer smiling. The staring contest was over. The real war was about to begin. The euphoria of killing the Persian cavalry commander didn't last long. In fact, it evaporated about as quickly as a drop of water on the hot Greek stone. It is now August. The Greek sun is a physical weight, hammering down on men encased in 60 pounds of bronze armour. Sweating is constant. Dehydration is a faster killer than any Persian arrow. Pausanias, the Spartan Regent, looked at his army and realised they had a problem. They were positioned on the high ground, safe from cavalry charges, but they were far from a reliable water source. Emboldened by their small victory against Mecistius, Pausanias ordered a manoeuvre. The entire Greek line, all 100,000 men, shuffled down from the safety of the foothills toward the Asopus River, settling near a vital water source called the Gargaphia Spring. It seemed like a good idea at the time. It wasn't. Mardonius watched them move. He didn't attack. He didn't send his infantry charging across the river to meet them in a glorious collision. Why would he? He saw exactly what Pausanias had done. The Greeks had just extended their neck. They were now closer to the enemy, but more importantly, their supply lines stretching back through the mountain passes were now exposed. Mardonius snapped his fingers and unleashed his cavalry again. But this time, their mission wasn't to kill soldiers, it was to strangle them. In a masterstroke of logistical warfare, Persian horsemen circled around the Greek army and struck the mountain passes behind them. They intercepted a massive convoy of 500 supply wagons, bringing food from the Peloponnese. They didn't just capture the wagons, they slaughtered the oxen and the drivers, leaving the Greek army completely cut off from bread. Suddenly, the Battle of Plataea wasn't about fighting, it was about starving. For 8 long days, the two armies sat there. The Greeks were terrified to move forward because the open ground was a death sentence against cavalry. They couldn't move back without looking like cowards. So they sat, baking in the heat, while Mardonius tightened the noose. Every day the Persian cavalry would ride up to the Asopus River, launch volleys of arrows into the Greek ranks, and then ride away laughing. They were taunting the Spartans. Come out and fight like men. But Pausanias held the line. He relied on that famous iron discipline. He forbade his men from breaking formation. But discipline doesn't quench thirst. Then came the breaking point. On the 11th day, Mardonius decided he was bored with waiting. He ordered his cavalry to bypass the Greek front line and hit their most vulnerable asset, the Gargaphia Spring. This wasn't a battle, it was vandalism. The Persian horses trampled the spring, churning the clear water into a thick, undrinkable slurry of mud and silt. In a matter of hours, the only source of water for an army of 100,000 men was destroyed. Picture the situation. It is nightfall. You haven't eaten a full meal in days, your lips are cracked from thirst, the spring is ruined, the enemy cavalry controls the roads behind you, you're trapped. Panic began to ripple through the coalition. The captains of the various Greek city-states started arguing. The Athenians wanted to attack. The Corinthians wanted to retreat. The Spartans were stonewalling. Pausanias, the man holding this fragile alliance together, realized he had no choice. If they stayed one more day, the army would dissolve from thirst or mutiny. He made a decision that is historically considered one of the most dangerous maneuvers in warfare, a tactical retreat at night, in the face of the enemy. The plan was complex but logical. At the second watch of the night, the entire army would pack up and pull back to a defensive position called the island, closer to the mountain and fresh water. It required absolute silence. It required perfect coordination. It required every single contingent to move at the exact same time without alerting the Persians just a few hundred yards away. It was a solid plan on paper, but as anyone who has studied military history knows, plans are the first casualty of reality. As the sun went down and the moon rose over the dark silhouette of Mount Cithaeron, the Greeks prepared to move. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to step into a comedy of errors that would nearly cost them Western civilization. If you want to understand why the Battle of Plataea was such a mess, you have to look at what happened that night. The plan was simple: withdraw to the high ground, regroup and drink some water. But as soon as the signal was given, the coalition fell apart. The centre of the Greek line, composed of soldiers from Corinth, Megara and other city-states, didn't just withdraw, they panicked. They grabbed their shields and practically sprinted away from the front. They didn't stop at the agreed-upon position. They kept going all the way back to the town of Plataea itself, huddled around the Temple of Hera, effectively taking themselves out of the fight. In the dark, the Greek army had just lost 50% of its manpower because of fear. But on the right wing, where the Spartans were stationed, the problem wasn't fear, it was pride. This brings us to one of the most stubborn men in history, Captain Amompharetos. He was the commander of the Lochos of Pitana, a prestigious Spartan unit. When the order came down from Pausanias to retreat, Amompharetos refused. He stood there, surrounded by his men, and told the regent of Sparta that he would not bring shame upon his country by running away from the strangers, his derogatory term for the Persians. Imagine the scene. It is 2 a.m. It is pitch black. The rest of the army is trying to sneak away in silence. And here is Pausanias, the supreme commander of the Greek forces, having a screaming match with one of his own captains. Pausanias begged him. He explained it wasn't a retreat, it was a tactical repositioning. Amompharetos didn't care about semantics. To a Spartan bred on the legend of Thermopylae, walking backward was heresy. The argument got physical. Amompharetos picked up a massive rock with both hands, a heavy stone from the riverbed. He slammed it down at Pausanias' feet with a thud that probably echoed through the valley. He pointed at the rock and shouted, "With this pebble, I cast my vote not to flee from the strangers." In Spartan democracy, they voted with pebbles. Amompharetos was mockingly using a boulder to cast his vote for death. While this ridiculous family drama was happening, the Athenians on the left wing were sitting there confused. They knew the Spartans were supposed to move first, but nothing was happening. They sent a runner over to the Spartan camp to see what was going on. The Athenian messenger found the Spartan commanders screaming at each other while the army stood motionless. The messenger essentially asked, guys, the sun is coming up, are we leaving or what?" Pausanias, exhausted and furious, finally made a call. He decided to leave Amompharetos behind. He ordered the rest of the Spartan army to begin the retreat, hoping that once Amompharetos saw his comrades leaving, he would swallow his pride and follow. It was a game of chicken played with thousands of lives. The main Spartan column began to march south, dragging their feet, constantly looking back. And sure enough, when Amompharetos realized he was truly being abandoned to face 300,000 Persians alone, he finally cracked. He ordered his men to pick up their shields and jog to catch up. But it was too late. The sky was turning grey. The birds were singing, the sun was cresting over the mountains. From the Persian camp across the river, the sentries rubbed their eyes. They looked out at the Greek position. The centre was gone. The Athenians were miles away on one side, obscured by hills, and on the other side, isolated and exposed on the rolling ridges, were the Spartans strung out in a long disorganised line, with Amompharetos' unit trailing behind like a lost child. General Mardonius stepped out of his tent and saw the gift the gods had given him. He didn't see a tactical retreat, he saw a rout. He saw a broken army fleeing in terror. He turned to his commanders, laughing. He mocked the reputation of the Spartans, shouting, "Are these the men who never run? Look at them!" He didn't wait for his infantry to form up properly. He didn't wait for a complex battle plan. He simply pointed at the retreating red cloaks and yelled, "Get them!" The dam broke. The Persian cavalry surged forward, crossing the river in a thundering wave. Behind them, the elite immortals and the rest of the infantry began to run, screaming their war cries. There was no order, no formation, just a massive, chaotic stampede of hunters chasing wounded prey. Pausanias, marching up the ridge, heard the sound first. A low rumble, then a roar. He turned around and saw the horizon fill with dust. He looked at his disorganized column. He looked at the Athenians far away on the left, unable to help. He looked at his allies hiding in the town of Plataea. He was alone. 10,000 Spartans and 35,000 light-armed slaves against the entire Persian Empire. The time for manoeuvring was over. The Battle of Plataea had officially begun, and the Spartans were caught flat-footed. The sun is up, and with it comes the shadow of death. Mardonius didn't send his infantry in for a fair fight. He was too smart for that. He ordered his archers, tens of thousands of them, to plant their wicker shields in the ground, forming a makeshift wall, and then simply darken the sky. This is where the Battle of Plataea turns into a psychological horror movie. The Spartans and their Tegean allies, totaling around 53,000 men, were stranded on the open slopes of the Cithaeron Ridge. They were not in battle formation. They were caught mid-march. As the Persian cavalry swarmed around the flanks, and the infantry archers unleashed volley after volley, the natural human instinct would be to either charge or run. Pausanias did neither. He ordered the army to halt and drop to one knee. Then, amidst the screaming of dying men and the clatter of thousands of arrows striking bronze shields, he turned his back on the enemy. He called for a priest. He needed to perform a sacrifice. In the ancient Greek world, you did not fight until the gods gave you the green light. A goat was dragged forward. Pausanias slit its throat and inspected the liver for omens. The signs were unpropitious. The gods said no, so Pausanias waited. Imagine being a soldier in that line. You're crouching behind your shield. You can hear the thud, thud, thud of arrows hitting the bronze face. You can hear the screams of the men next to you as arrows find the gaps in their armour, the neck, the groin, the unarmoured feet, and your general is staring at a goat's entrails, shaking his head. Now, shift your perspective. Look at the man crouching behind the Spartan. This is a Helot. He doesn't have a bronze shield, he has a wicker target or animal skins. He's a slave, dragged here to carry supplies and throw javelins for a master who oppresses him. But right now, the arrows don't discriminate. The Helots were dying in droves. For them, this wasn't noble discipline, it was insanity. They were watching their masters stand like statues, refusing to fight back while the world ended around them. The slaughter was passive, industrial, and excruciatingly slow. One of the most tragic casualties was a Spartan named Leonidas. Herodotus tells us he was the most beautiful man in the Greek army, a perfect physical specimen. Before the battle even officially started, an arrow plunged into his side. He was carried to the rear, dying slowly in agony. His last words weren't about pain, they were about frustration. He told a friend, "I do not mind dying for Greece. What I mind is that I die without having struck a blow, without having used my hands." This went on for an eternity. Another goat was brought up. Throat slit, liver inspected. Bad omens. Wait. The Persian infantry, emboldened by the lack of resistance, moved closer. They were now within shouting distance, pouring fire into the motionless Greek ranks. The Tegeans, the allies on the Spartan flank, couldn't take it anymore. They started to shift, ready to charge without orders. Pausanias glared at them. He looked up to the Temple of Hera on the distant hill, tears streaming down his face. A rare display of emotion for a Spartan. He screamed a prayer to the goddess, begging her not to let them die in shame. It was the ultimate test of Greek hoplite tactics. The phalanx is strong, but its weakness is its rigidity. But here, that rigidity, that brainwashed adherence to orders, was the only thing keeping them from routing. If they had charged individually, the cavalry would have picked them apart. By forcing them to suffer in place, Pausanias was keeping the formation tight. Finally, just as the Tegeans were about to disobey and charge on their own, a third goat was sacrificed. Pausanias looked down. The liver was good. The omens had shifted. Pausanias stood up. He didn't need a speech. He didn't need a trumpet. He simply raised his spear. The iron discipline that had kept 10,000 men frozen in a storm of arrows suddenly released. The statues came to life. The Spartans didn't just walk, they exploded forward. The pent-up rage of an hour of passive dying was about to be unleashed on the Persian line. The waiting was over. The butchery was about to begin. The collision of the two armies was not the clang of sword on sword, it was the sickening crunch of wood shattering under the weight of bronze. The Persians had set up a barrier of wicker shields to protect their archers. Against light infantry, these shields were excellent. But against the Greek hoplite tactics of a charging Spartan phalanx, they might as well have been made of paper. When Pausanias lowered his spear, the Spartans didn't just charge, they surged forward like a dam bursting. They crashed into the Persian line with such kinetic force that the front ranks of the Immortals were physically lifted off their feet and trampled. The wicker wall disintegrated instantly. Now, the battle entered the phase the Greeks called the othismos, the shoving match, and this is where the technological gap between East and West became fatal. The Persians were brave. Let's be very clear about this. They were not cowards. Herodotus vividly describes them grabbing the Spartan spears with their bare hands and snapping the wooden shafts in a desperate attempt to disarm the enemy. They threw themselves at the wall of shields, using daggers and short swords, trying to find gaps. They fought with the ferocity of lions, but courage cannot defeat physics. The Persians were wearing linen tunics or scale armour that was designed to stop arrows, not heavy thrusts. The Spartans, on the other hand, were encased in bronze from chin to knee. When a Persian struck a Spartan, his blade often glanced off the curved shield or the breastplate. When a Spartan struck a Persian, he went through bone. Once the long spears shattered in the initial crush, the Spartans drew their xiphos, the short leaf-shaped sword designed for close-quarters butchery. This is where the Spartan revenge truly began. They moved with a robotic industrial efficiency, stabbed to the face, bash with the shield rim, step forward over the corpse, repeat. The Helots, previously dying passively under the arrow storm, now swarmed into the gaps. Armed with slings, javelins and knives, they finished off the wounded Persians that the Spartiates knocked down. It was a meat grinder. The dust rose so thick that men fought by silhouette and sound. The screaming was constant, a mix of Persian commands and the guttural roars of Greeks releasing months of pent-up frustration. In the centre of this swirling chaos was Mardonius. Unlike Xerxes, who watched battles from a high throne on a hill, Mardonius was right in the thick of it. He sat atop a magnificent white charger, surrounded by his elite bodyguard of 1,000 picked men. He was fighting brilliantly, cutting down any Spartan foolish enough to break rank. His presence was the glue holding the Persian army together. As long as they could see that white horse and the general's purple cloak, the Persians fought on, even as they were being slaughtered. The Spartans saw him too. They realized that this wasn't just a battle of attrition, it was a headhunting mission. The Phalanx shifted its weight. Like a predator smelling blood, the Spartan line began to grind its way toward the man on the white horse. They ignored the piles of gold and silver jewellery worn by the fallen immortals. They ignored the expensive fabrics. They wanted the head of the man who burned Athens. The distance between Pausanias' front line and Mardonius' bodyguard began to shrink. The Persians threw everything they had into the gap to protect their commander. Bodies, horses, furniture from the camp. But the bronze wall kept coming, step by bloody step. The black sacrifice Pausanias had offered to the gods was no longer a goat. It was the Persian army itself. The circle around Mardonius was shrinking. The 1,000 elite Persians guarding him were dying one by one, their bodies forming a ramp of flesh that the Spartans climbed over to get closer to the prize. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was an assassination attempt by an army. History records the name of the man who delivered the final blow, Arimnestos. He was a Spartan of immense renown, a man whose name translates roughly to the one who is remembered, and on this day he earned it. Arimnestos spotted Mardonius on his white horse, rising above the dusty melee like a lighthouse in a storm. The Persian general was fighting bravely, cutting down Spartans from his saddle. But bravery is no substitute for a 20-pound ash spear driven by the muscle of a man who has trained for war since the age of 7. Arimnestos lunged. The blow was catastrophic. Some accounts say a rock crushed Mardonius' skull, others say a spear pierced his chest. But the result was the same. The general of the Persian Empire, the cousin of Xerxes, the burner of Athens, was knocked from his horse and slammed into the bloody dirt of Boeotia. He didn't get up. The moment Mardonius hit the ground, the sound of the battle changed. The roar of the Persian army faltered. You see, ancient armies were like snakes. Cut off the head and the body writhes and dies. The immortals, seeing their leader fallen, finally broke. These men who had never taken a backward step, who had terrified the known world, threw down their wicker shields and ran. But the most telling moment came from Artabazus, the second in command of the Persian forces. He had been commanding a reserve force of 40,000 men, a force large enough to potentially flank the Spartans and win the battle. But Artabazus was a survivor. He watched from a distance as Mardonius fell. He saw the Spartan machine grinding forward. He did the math. Instead of charging in to save the day, he turned his horse around and ordered his 40,000 men to march in the opposite direction. Not back to camp, but straight out of Greece. He abandoned the army to its fate. It was a cold, calculated betrayal that sealed the doom of everyone left behind. The remaining Persian forces, leaderless, terrified and abandoned, panicked. They didn't retreat in an organised fashion. They routed. A chaotic river of humanity flowed backward toward the great wooden stockade they had built days earlier. They scrambled inside the wooden walls, barred the gates and climbed the towers, hoping the fortifications would save them. They were wrong. They had just trapped themselves in a cage with a tiger. The Spartans arrived at the walls of the stockade shortly after. But here is a surprising fact. Spartans were terrible at siege warfare. They were trained to fight in open fields, not to climb walls. For a moment, the Persians held them off, raining arrows down on the Spartans pacing below like frustrated wolves. It looked like a stalemate. But then, the Athenians arrived. Remember them? They had been busy fighting the pro-Persian Greeks on the other side of the battlefield, but hearing of the victory, they sprinted to join the Spartans. And unlike the Spartans, the Athenians were engineers. They knew how to take a wall. The Athenians breached the stockade. They tore down a section of the wooden rampart, creating a breach, and through that breach poured the full, unadulterated fury of the Lacedaemonians. What followed inside that fort was not a battle, it was the slaughter. This is the part of the Battle of Plataea that history books often gloss over because it is uncomfortable. The Greeks didn't take prisoners, they didn't accept surrenders. They moved through the crowded camp where tens of thousands of Persians were trapped with nowhere to run, and they killed everything that moved. It was a methodical extermination. The frustration of Thermopylae, the anger over the burning of Athens, the misery of the thirsty nights. It was all taken out on the trapped Persians. The ground inside the fort became a sludge of mud and blood so deep it reached the ankles. Of the nearly 260,000 Persians who had stayed with Mardonius, excluding Artabazus's deserters, ancient sources claim only 3,000 survived the day. While those numbers are likely exaggerated by Greek historians, the archaeological reality is clear. An entire generation of Persian manpower was wiped off the face of the earth in a single afternoon. When the screaming finally stopped, a strange silence fell over the carnage. The dust settled on the greatest graveyard the Greek world had ever seen. But as the Spartans and Athenians wiped the blood from their eyes, they began to realize something else. They were standing on a fortune. The Persian camp wasn't just a military base, it was a mobile palace. Mardonius had inherited the personal tent of King Xerxes when the monarch fled, and he had lived in imperial splendor. We are talking about gold mixing bowls, silver tables, tapestries woven with purple dye worth more than the soldier's life, and chests overflowing with minted darics. For the Greeks, who lived relatively simple lives, especially the Spartans, whose currency was literally heavy iron bars to discourage hoarding, this was like walking into a fever dream. There is a famous story from Herodotus that perfectly captures the absurdity of this moment. It is perhaps the defining scene of the entire Greco-Persian wars. General Pausanias, still covered in the grime of battle, walked into Mardonius's pavilion. He looked at the silk hangings and the gold-plated furniture. He saw the Persian chefs terrified and cowering in the corner. Instead of killing them, Pausanias gave them a bizarre order. He told them to prepare a meal exactly as they would have prepared it for Mardonius. The chefs went to work. They roasted exotic meats, baked soft breads, opened amphorae of sweet wine, and laid out a feast fit for a god on silver platters, the tent filled with the smell of saffron and roasting fat. Then, Pausanias turned to his own Spartan cooks and gave a second order. Prepare a standard Spartan mess. The Spartan cooks threw some lentils, pork blood and vinegar into a pot and boiled it into the infamous black broth. A meal so unappetizing that a visitor once joked, "Now I understand why Spartans are not afraid to die." Pausanias placed the two meals side by side. On the left, the culinary height of the greatest empire on earth. On the right, a bowl of brown sludge. He called his commanders into the tent. He pointed to the Persian feast, then to the Spartan slop and started laughing. He said to them, "Men of Greece, I brought you here to show you the folly of the leader of the Medes. Look at how he lived." He had all of this luxury, yet he came here to rob us, who have so little. It was a moment of profound irony. The Persians had everything to lose and nothing to gain. The Greeks had nothing to lose but their freedom. That contrast, between the soft luxury of the East and the hard poverty of the West, became the propaganda image that would define Western identity for centuries. But looking back, it was also a warning. Pausanias stood there, mocking the gold, acting the part of the incorruptible Spartan. But history tells us that as he stared at that gold, something inside him broke. The man who mocked the feast would soon become addicted to the taste of it. The victory at the Battle of Plataea saved Greece, but it doomed Pausanias. The seeds of his own destruction were planted right there, amidst the laughter and the loot. While the blood was drying in the dirt of Plataea, something almost supernatural was happening across the Aegean Sea. Legend tells us that on the exact same afternoon, the Greek fleet launched an amphibious assault on the Persian remnants at Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor. They burned the Persian ships, slaughtered their garrison, and effectively ended the Persian wars in a single synchronized double tap. The great King Xerxes had no army left in Europe, and no navy left to bring them there. The West was saved. But history has a cruel sense of humour. The end of the war was simply the beginning of the tragedy. You see, the alliance between Sparta and Athens was always a marriage of convenience, like a wolf and a shark agreeing to hunt together. Once the prey was dead, they looked at each other with suspicion. Athens, fueled by the confidence of their naval victories, returned home not as refugees but as conquerors. They rebuilt their walls, built a massive fleet, and formed the Delian League, an empire in all but name. They took the freedom they had fought for at Plataea and monetized it, demanding tribute from other islands. The golden age of Athens was built on the reputation earned in the blood of 479 BC. But the darkest shadow fell upon the hero of Plataea himself, General Pausanias. Remember that feast? The moment he mocked the Persian luxury? It turns out he wasn't mocking it because he hated it. He was mocking it because he wanted it. The man who had commanded the iron discipline of the Spartan army returned home, but his soul stayed in Mardonius's tent. Slowly, bizarre reports began to reach the Spartan ephors. Travellers claimed that Pausanias was no longer acting like a Spartan. When he was sent abroad on campaigns, he stopped wearing the rough red cloak of his people. Instead, he was seen wearing the long purple robes of a Persian satrap. He stopped eating black broth and began dining on elaborate banquets. Even worse, he hired a private bodyguard of Egyptians and Persians to surround him, refusing to let his fellow Greeks approach. It was unimaginable. This was the regent of Sparta, the man who had avenged Leonidas, now cosplaying as the enemy he had destroyed. Rumours swirled that he was secretly writing letters to Xerxes, offering to deliver all of Greece to Persia in exchange for the king's daughter's hand in marriage. The saviour of Western civilization had become a traitor. The Spartans, terrified of his growing power and erratic behaviour, recalled him to Sparta. They put him on trial, but he was acquitted due to lack of hard evidence, and likely because of his royal status. But Pausanias didn't stop. He continued his intrigues, allegedly stirring up the Helots, the very slaves he'd commanded at Plataea, promising them freedom if they helped him overthrow the Spartan government. That was the final straw. To a Spartan, conspiring with Persia was bad, but arming the Helots was unforgivable. It was a violation of the fundamental social contract of their society. The ephors needed proof. They set a trap. They had a servant hide behind a partition while Pausanias discussed his treasonous plans. The evidence was secured. The most famous general in the world, the victor of the Battle of Plataea, was now a hunted man in his own city. He wasn't defeated by a Persian arrow or a cavalry charge. He was defeated by his own ego. The poison of victory had done what Mardonius never could. It destroyed the leader of the Spartans. And as the ephors marched to arrest him, Pausanias made one last desperate run, not to a battlefield but to a temple. Pausanias, the man who broke the Persian Empire, ran for his life through the streets of Sparta. He wasn't running from an enemy army, he was running from his own people. He sprinted into the temple of Athena of the Brazen House, claiming sanctuary. In the ancient world, you could not kill a man inside a temple without angering the gods. The ephors arrived at the temple doors and stopped. They were trapped by their own laws. They couldn't drag him out and they couldn't go in with swords, so they came up with a solution that was uniquely, terrifyingly Spartan. If they couldn't touch him, they would simply make sure he never left. They ordered the doors to be bricked up, and here is the detail that hurts the most. Legend tells us that as the Spartans gathered stones to seal the entrance, an old woman walked through the crowd. It was Pausanias' own mother. She didn't cry, she didn't beg for her son's life. She simply picked up a heavy stone, walked to the temple door and placed it on the threshold in silence. Then she walked away. It was the ultimate rejection. By placing that first stone, she was voting for his death, choosing the honour of Sparta over the life of her child. For days, the hero of Plataea sat in the darkness of the temple. No food, no water, just the sound of his own breathing and the smell of the incense he could no longer offer. As he lay dying of starvation, the ephors waited outside. Just moments before his heart stopped, they dragged his emaciated body out into the sunlight so he wouldn't die inside and spiritually pollute the holy ground. He died essentially a prisoner, a traitor, and a disgrace. This is why we don't make movies about the Battle of Plataea. It's messy, it's complicated. The hero becomes a villain. The good guys commit war crimes. The victory leads to greed and imperialism. Compare that to Thermopylae. Thermopylae is clean. The 300 die. They are beautiful, noble, and morally pure because they didn't live long enough to be corrupted. We prefer the beautiful defeat to the ugly victory. We prefer the martyr Leonidas to the conqueror Pausanias. But we must not forget the truth. Thermopylae was a symbol, but Plataea was the salvation. It was at Plataea, on those dusty, blood-soaked plains, that 10,000 Spartans and their allies did the impossible. They looked the apocalypse in the eye and didn't blink. They proved that a free people, fighting for their homes and their laws, could break the back of a global superpower. It was brutal, it was savage, and it was necessary. So the next time you hear about the 300 Spartans, remember the 10,000 who came after them. Remember the vengeance, remember the victory, and remember the price. If you made it this far, you're a true history enthusiast. Please verify your subscription now. It really helps the channel keep these forgotten stories alive. Check out this next video on the screen about the rise of the Athenian Empire, where we explore what happened to the gold Pausanias laughed at. I'll see you there.